Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled you're here with us today because, wow, we are diving into one of the most profound and honestly brilliantly structured pieces of literature in all of human history. We're talking about the Book of Job. Now, a lot of times Job gets watered down, right? Reduced to just this basic story of human endurance or like a cautionary tale about patience. But actually, scratch that. It is so much more than that. It is a deep theological exploration of faith, suffering, and ultimately the reality of a redeemer. This isn't just a simple story about a guy who loses everything. It's a profoundly challenging text that forces us to examine how we view God when the bottom absolutely drops out of our lives. And it all kicks off with the question that literally every single one of us has asked, or let's be real, is going to ask at some point. Why do bad things happen to good people? Or even the flip side, why do good things sometimes happen to bad people? I mean, if God is perfectly just, why does he allow such profound suffering? It's incredibly natural to wonder this, guys. This is the deeply existential human experience. If you have ever struggled with this question, you need to know right out of the gate that your struggle is entirely valid. The Book of Job doesn't just shy away from this agony, it leans right into it. Job, he was one of those genuinely good people who just experienced an absolute avalanche of truly terrible things. Okay, let's dive into this roadmap together. We're going to navigate these incredibly weighty concepts in 5 key steps. 1. The problem of righteous suffering. 2. Rejecting the punishment myth. 3. Refined to come forth gold. 4. Perspective shift through creation. And finally 5. I know my Redeemer lives. All right, starting right off with section 1. The problem of righteous suffering. So before tragedy struck, Job was this incredibly righteous guy with unimpeachable integrity. Yet he gets hit with devastating, compounding losses. We're talking his wealth, his children, his health, everything. It completely sets the stage for a deeply personal, micro-level struggle. He was doing everything right, and yet his world literally fell apart. Because of these intense trials, Job actually started to wonder if God was just after all. And hey, this brings us to a massively important takeaway. In the Book of Job, questioning and testing your faith, that is part of the process. It's absolutely not a sign of failure. The text makes it beautifully clear that having questions does not make you a bad believer. Job questioned everything. His faith was pushed to its absolute breaking point, but he never completely walked away from it. The big lesson? Faith and unanswered questions can gracefully coexist. You really don't need a perfectly resolved theological equation to keep your integrity intact. Now, looking at the opening chapters, we get this fascinating, almost poetic setup. Satan steps in acting as the adversary or the accuser. And our source text points out this isn't necessarily like a literal boardroom meeting up in heaven, but more of a poetic framing of a profound question. Satan basically claims that Job only obeys God for the blessings. It's a totally transactional accusation, right? Like, he only loves you because you pay him well. It tests whether faith actually sticks around when the rewards are entirely stripped away. I want you to just pause and reflect on that for a second. Why do we remain faithful to God? If the blessings just vanish tomorrow, would your faith survive? That's the intense crucible Job is thrown into. And that crucible leads us directly into section 2, rejecting the punishment myth. Okay, so when Job's life completely unravels, these 3 friends show up to comfort him. But that comfort pretty quickly devolves into an intense debate. We kind of need to put our analytical hats on right here because Job is about to do some major myth-busting against the cultural assumptions of his time. And this brilliantly illustrates the divide. On one side, we have his friends' logic. Their worldview was super simple. Adversity is divine punishment for sin. So to them, Job must have done something incredibly wicked to deserve this. Just confess and God will fix it. It is a toxic transactional myth. But contrast that with Job's truth. Job knows his own heart. He fiercely maintains his innocence. He realizes that suffering does not automatically equal punishment. He stands his ground, asserting that faith can and honestly must coexist with unanswered questions. His friend's rigid logic just couldn't handle a world where good people suffer. But Job's integrity? It forces us to accept that complex reality. So, if suffering isn't just a punishment for hidden sins, what purpose could it possibly serve? That brings us to section 3, refined to come forth gold, finding purpose in adversity. But before we dig into the why, we have to look at Job's ultimate decision, smack in the middle of his pain, surrounded by the absolutely terrible advice of his friends. Job drops this powerhouse quote, "In him will I trust." Think about that. Even though he has 0 bullet points explaining his suffering, and even though God is totally silent at this point, Job makes this incredibly conscious choice to anchor himself in trust. He essentially decides to trust the character of God, even when the actions of God are completely incomprehensible to him. And why is that trust so absolutely vital? Well, biblical theology teaches that adversity and suffering can refine us so we emerge like gold. Job himself later declares that when he has been tried, he shall come forth as gold. Let's just slow down here for a second. Think about the metaphor of a refiner's fire. The intense heat, it isn't there to destroy the precious metal, it's literally there to burn away the impurities. While we might not have all the specific answers as to why a certain tragedy strikes, the profound imagery here is that suffering, when it's met with faith, possesses this incredible, transformative, refining power. Now we hit a major paradigm shift in Section 4, perspective shift through creation. So, for over 30 chapters, Job has practically been demanding that God explain himself. Finally, God responds out of a whirlwind, but not with answers. Instead, he takes Job on this mind-blowing tour of the cosmos. God asks Job where he was when the foundations of the earth were laid. He talks about the morning stars singing together. He points out the mighty behemoth and the formidable leviathan, these creatures so wild and massive that ancient audiences often viewed them as mythical sea dragons or untamable beasts. Our source material compares reading these chapters to taking a walk outside and looking at things from totally different perspectives, up close, far away, from the stars all the way down to the deep sea. God is using the sheer, staggering scale of the universe to completely humble Job. And the crucial takeaway here is that we receive a deeper revelation of God's majesty rather than just a simple checklist of answers. Notice that God never actually tells Job why he suffered. He doesn't even mention the wager with Satan. Instead, this cosmic perspective completely shifts Job's view away from his immediate, agonizing suffering and toward a profound trust in a vastly intelligent, all-powerful creator. The message is pretty clear. If God is capable of designing the intricate, mind-boggling balance of the universe, he is definitely capable of managing the complexities of our lives, even when we can't see the blueprint. Which brings us to our fifth and final section, I know my Redeemer lives, the ultimate anchor. This right here is the emotional and spiritual climax of the entire book of Job. It's where we find true resolution, not through intellectual answers, but through a profound, enduring relationship. Just to recap the sheer heavy weight of what Job is pushing through, he faced extreme physical loss. He lost his health to the point of being totally unrecognizable. He faced emotional betrayal from his closest friends, who basically accused him of being a secret sinner. He experienced profound, crushing isolation. Job hit the absolute darkest depths a human being can possibly reach. Now, what's really interesting here is that right in the middle of that darkness, in chapter 19, Job utters the most triumphant, piercing declaration of faith in the entire Old Testament. I know that my Redeemer liveth. This is not just wishful thinking, folks. This is his ultimate spiritual breakthrough. Think about it. A Redeemer is someone who buys back, someone who rescues, someone who vindicates. Job realizes that his vindication isn't going to come from his friends, and, it might not even come in this mortal life, but he has a living Redeemer. This absolute knowledge becomes the core anchor of his faith, the ultimate proof that his suffering is not the end of his story. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative question drawn directly from Job's experience. How might looking at the stars, or nature, change your perspective on your current trials? The source material we reviewed really invites us to step outside, to actively observe God's creations, both large and small. So the next time your trials feel completely overwhelming, I challenge you to step outside, look up at the night sky, and let the sheer majesty of the universe elevate your perspective. Because the very same God who calls the stars by name is the Redeemer who lives for you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep seeking that higher perspective.